Hello there, sending you a big smile and some good vibes. Today, I want to tell you a story that you probably won't be able to stop listening to, because it begins with a shove through a glass door and ends with a courtroom verdict so shocking the entire room went silent. The woman at the heart of it, Adelaide Fairfax, 71 years old, was pushed out of her own home by her son and daughter-in-law, her blood staining the icy snow of Denver. They thought they had finally gotten rid of the useless old woman, but what they didn't know was that she held a $21 million trust fund and a hidden video tucked inside a porcelain owl on her bookshelf, proof powerful enough to turn everything upside down, from silence to justice, from betrayal to reckoning. This story will make you ask yourself, if your own flesh and blood pushed you out the door, would you stay silent or rise up like Adelaide? Stay until the very end, because the truth revealed in the final chapter will take your breath away. I am Adelaide Fairfax, 71 years old. One winter afternoon in Denver, with the sky dull and gray and the wind cutting like glass, I realized that the coldest thing that day wasn't the weather. It was my own son's eyes. In the bright steel kitchen I had once picked tile by tile, Sloane, Daniel's wife, stood with her arms crossed, her voice honey-sweet but sharp enough to wound. "We're only trying to help you, Mom," she said, lips tight, her gaze flicking toward the house deed on the counter. "Keeping the property in your name isn't practical. You should think about the future and simplify things." The future. That word felt hollow coming from her mouth. I turned to Daniel, hoping for hesitation, a flicker of the boy who once ran into my arms during storms. But he didn't look up. He just scrolled through his phone, pretending to be busy with something more important than his own mother. I spoke slowly, steady. "This house belongs to us, Daniel. I'm not ready to sign anything. We'll talk later, after dinner." My voice trembled, not from fear, but because I could feel my heart cracking. Sloane raised an eyebrow and set her coffee cup down. The porcelain hit the counter with a sharp, cold sound. "You always delay, Adelaide. You don't understand law or the market. It's time you let us handle things." She stepped closer. Her long fingers rested on mine, pretending to be gentle, but the pressure made me take half a step back. Daniel stayed silent. I searched his face, looking for my son, but the boy I knew was gone, replaced by a man who hid behind silence while his wife spoke for him. "Go outside for some air," Sloane said evenly, almost like a command. I hesitated. Then suddenly 2 bodies moved toward me, fast, a hard shove, and then the sound of shattering glass. The world tilted. My back slammed into the sliding door, and then I was falling. The first thing I felt was cold, then pain, sharp and deep. The glass tore through my coat, slicing my skin. I landed in the snow, hearing the crack of breaking and my own ragged breath. Everything went silent. No screams, no tears, just a heavy stillness, so deep I could hear my own heartbeat echoing. From inside, Sloane's voice cut through the quiet. "She slipped!" Oh my God, she just slipped. Too rehearsed, too fast. Daniel stood in the broken doorway, half hidden by shadow. He looked at me, or rather, down at me, but didn't move, didn't reach out, didn't speak, just stood there, frozen in his own cowardice. I tried to rise, blood seeping through my gray sweater. My fingers brushed the old silver locket my husband had given me in 1983. A deep scratch ran across it, like fate had carved a warning. Each breath burned. The snow stung my wounds like needles. They didn't come out. No one said, "Mom, are you okay?" So I turned away and walked, step by step through the freezing street, the light from my kitchen flickering behind me, reflecting off the blood-stained shards of glass. I didn't look back, because if I did, I would break. Down Maple Street, windows glowed gold with warmth. Laughter, roasted chicken, cinnamon cookies. And me, a mother cast out of her own home, heard nothing but the crunch of her own footsteps. At the hill's end, a patrol car passed, red and blue lights flashing across my face. The officer slowed, but I shook my head. I couldn't speak. Not yet, because I knew some wounds need silence to carry their weight. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Snow hissed under the tires as I drove toward the urgent care near downtown. Inside, bright lights, the sting of antiseptic. "Did you fall, ma'am?" a nurse asked. I smiled faintly. Yes, slipped by the door. No one questioned further. The doctor cleaned the cuts, wrapped my arm, handed me painkillers. He paused, looked at me carefully, then wrote in his report, "Possible domestic fall." I held that paper like a ticket into a long war. Outside, snow began to fall again. Soft, steady, whispering, "Don't collapse." I drove to a cheap motel in Cherry Creek, paid cash, gave no name. In the room, I washed the blood away, changed clothes, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing. It was nearly midnight. I pulled a folded note from my wallet, 4 faded words scrawled on it. Proof, law, assets, self. I rewrote them on the motel notepad with a trembling hand. Then I thought of the porcelain owl on my bookshelf, the one with black glass eyes. Inside it was a hidden camera I had installed months ago, after feeling unsafe in my own home. Maybe that owl was now the only witness left. I unlocked my phone and texted Priya, the tech friend who once helped set up my cloud storage. "Priya, I need footage from the old camera. Urgent." She replied 2 minutes later. "Send me the device ID. I'll pull it now." An hour later, as I dozed off, my phone buzzed again. "Recovered everything. Private link sent. No one else can access. Addie, are you okay?" I didn't answer. I opened the file. On the dim laptop screen appeared my kitchen. Me at the counter, Sloane facing me, Daniel to the right. Then movement. A shove. Glass exploding. My body disappearing from frame. No argument left to make. No, she slipped. No misunderstanding. Only truth and silence. I closed the laptop. Tears filled my eyes but didn't fall. They trembled there, waiting for permission. I wiped them away and breathed deeply. In that damp, paint-scented motel room, I sat still for a long time, because I knew, from that moment on, the fight had begun. Not with shouting, not with revenge, but with truth and the law. And if you've listened this far, if you've ever felt the sting of being betrayed by your own, then hit like and comment 1 below so I'll know you believe, as I do, that silence is not weakness, and justice always finds those who stand up for themselves. I sat still in that motel room, listening to the wind howl through the window cracks, so cold it made my heart tremble. But in that moment, I knew I would not stay silent any longer. The 4 words on the paper, proof, law, assets, self, still lay before me like a quiet vow. I had proof. Now I needed the law. I unlocked my phone and scrolled through my contacts. At the very bottom was a name I'd once jotted down after a legal seminar years ago. Ruth Delgado, elder law attorney. That day, she'd stood on stage, her voice rough but firm as steel. "Silence from the elderly is the weapon others use against them." I'd smiled back then, not realizing how true it would become. I called. A young assistant answered, brisk and polite. I'd like to schedule a meeting with Attorney Delgado, I said. It's about a case of domestic assault. A brief pause, then her voice softened. We can fit you in tomorrow at 2 p.m., ma'am. The office is on 17th Street downtown. I'll be there, I replied. When I hung up, my hands were still shaking, not from fear, but because I knew that after that meeting there would be no turning back. The next morning, Denver was painted in shades of ash. The snow had stopped, but the streets were slick with ice. I looked at myself in the mirror, swollen eyes, faint bruises on my cheek. I chose my simplest outfit, a long coat, a wool scarf, thick gloves, not to hide but to look like myself, the woman they thought was weak, but who was quietly coming back to life. Ruth Delgado's office sat in an old downtown building where the walls still smelled of polished wood and paper. When I walked in, a silver-haired woman looked up from her desk, sharp-eyed and calm. Mrs. Fairfax? I nodded. She stood, extended a hand. I'm Ruth. Please sit. Let's talk. I set my bag on the table and opened it. Inside were my medical report, prescription papers, photos of the bruises, and a USB drive holding the video from the porcelain owl. You have evidence? Ruth asked. I do, I said softly, clearer than memory. She examined each page, each image, then plugged in the USB. The sound of shattering glass filled the quiet office, so loud my pulse raced. When the screen went black, Ruth leaned back and nodded. That's enough. This wasn't an accident, Adelaide. This is assault, and under Colorado law it qualifies as elder abuse. I lowered my head, my fingers clutching each other. I don't want to see my son in prison, I whispered. I just want the truth recognized, and I want them to never touch what I've built again. Ruth studied me for a moment, then nodded. Then that's what we'll do. Properly. Through the law. I'll file for an emergency protection order and notify every bank, notary office, and property registry connected to your name. From this moment, they'll be locked out of your records. I exhaled. A long, heavy breath, like surfacing from deep water. She continued, I'll also need you to sign an affidavit detailing everything. Every word, every movement. I nodded. Are you ready? She asked. I answered, I've been ready since the moment my blood hit the snow. Ruth smiled faintly. Not a comforting smile, but one that said the game had begun. That afternoon, as I stepped out of the building, the wind caught my scarf and spun it into the air. But this time, I didn't feel cold. Inside my coat pocket lay a copy of the court petition, warmer than anything I'd ever held. I stopped at the curb, watching people rush past, each carrying their own quiet battles. No one knew that a 71-year-old woman had just filed a lawsuit against her own son. I closed my eyes and breathed in. Silence has a sound, I whispered. They just haven't heard it yet. That evening, my phone rang. It was Oliver Grant, the advisor who'd helped me set up my trust fund more than a decade ago. His voice was calm, deep. Addie, something odd happened today. 2 people claiming to be your legal representatives came to the bank. They brought notarized documents, but the signatures were fake. I froze. Their names? The man was Daniel Fairfax. The woman, Sloane Mercer. Hearing their names felt like a blade to the chest. Don't worry, Oliver said firmly. We stopped them. Your voice print security blocked their access. I've filed a report with the Internal Fraud Department and the Central Bank. Your assets are completely safe. I was quiet for a long moment. Then I said softly, Thank you, Oliver. "Thank you for believing me when no one else did." He replied, "No, Addie. Thank you for believing in yourself." When the call ended, I sat in the dim light, papers scattered across the table. I thought of Daniel, his downcast eyes that night. Was it guilt or fear? Did he realize he'd already lost me long before that fall? I had no tears left, only silence, thick as glass, the kind they thought they'd shoved me through, not knowing it had only made me clearer and stronger. I picked up my pen and wrote one more line beneath the 4 words. Silence is my weapon, and not to hide, but so they'd hear its echo when justice finally spoke. I packed the papers, turned off the light. Outside, snow fell again, covering the old ice. But this time it didn't feel cold. It only reminded me that every wound can be covered, but never erased. And if you've listened this far, I want to ask you something from the heart. If it were you, would you stand up against your own family after a betrayal like this? Leave a comment below. Tell me if you agree with my choice to fight back in silence, or disagree, believing I've gone too far, because sometimes your voice is exactly the sound of justice someone else needs to hear. I knew that the moment I signed the papers with Ruth, there was no turning back. But what I didn't expect was how quickly everything would start to shift. The next morning, I woke up in the small motel room, the heater coughing in the corner. Outside, the snow had stopped, replaced by Denver's pale winter light, gray, silent, and heavy. I poured myself a cup of coffee, my hands still trembling from the cold. On the table lay the stack of documents Ruth had given me the night before. Thick pages with my name printed clearly at the top of each one. Complaint, protective order request, temporary asset freeze, all neatly prepared, as if this battle had been scripted long ago, waiting only for my signature. I stared at the line that read, Fairfax, Adelaide versus Fairfax, Daniel, and Mercer, Sloane. And for a moment I couldn't tell if what I felt was pain or relief. The name Fairfax had once meant family pride. Now it was a line drawn between mother and son. Around 9 a.m., Ruth called. Her calm voice carried a quiet warning. Addie, be careful. Once we file, they'll know. I wouldn't be surprised if Daniel or Sloane tries to reach out, to persuade you, or to intimidate you. I smiled faintly. If they have the courage to look me in the eye, I'll take it as a sign of manners. Ruth chuckled softly. You're stronger than they think. But remember, from now on, silence is our ally. After the call, I stepped outside. The cold hit hard, my breath turning into white mist. I walked to the nearby post office to send a few letters. One to Oliver Grant, confirming that the asset protection process was in motion. Another to Ruth, containing a copy of my medical report, what she called each brick in the wall of law. When I returned to the motel, a black SUV was parked across the street. Inside sat a woman, blonde hair, wool coat, dark glasses. I recognized that silhouette instantly. Sloane. My heart skipped. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared through the glass, her gaze cutting like ice. I went inside and closed the curtain. I didn't need to see more. The sound of her engine fading away was enough. That night, Ruth called again. The court has accepted our emergency filing, she said. We'll have a preliminary hearing next week. For now, there's a no-contact order in place. They're forbidden to approach or contact you within 100 meters. For a long moment, I said nothing. Then, quietly replied, for the first time in months, I feel safe. Ruth answered softly. You deserve that, Adelaide. 2 days later, another call, this time from Oliver. His voice was steady, but heavy. Addie, the bank sent me a copy of their internal investigation. There are forged signatures and a fake notarization from an office in Aurora. The bank is pursuing fraud charges. I froze. They faked a notary seal? Maybe not by their own hands, but they ordered it. And the good news? Everything leaves a trail. You wanted the truth to have weight. Well, now it does. I opened the email he sent. Scanned images of the falsified document glared back at me. A clumsy imitation of my handwriting. The signature trembling. The notary stamp smudged. Enough to trigger a criminal inquiry. I stared at it for a long time, then laughed softly. Not from joy, but because they had just paved my road to victory. That evening, I called Ruth and told her everything. She listened, then said simply, Good. Don't be afraid. We'll let them fall into the trap they built. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, the streetlight casting my reflection on the glass. The bruises were fading, but my eyes were different now. No longer the eyes of a fragile mother waiting for remorse, but the eyes of a woman who refused to be erased from her own story. I opened my laptop and played the video again. No tears this time. Just calm focus. Noting every frame, every timestamp, every word. Especially Sloane's voice screaming she slipped. I sent a copy to Ruth and saved another in an encrypted drive. Each click of the save button felt like another brick of justice locking into place. Near midnight, I heard a soft knock at the door. My heart tightened, part fear, part readiness. I peered through the peephole. No one there. Only an envelope on the floor, its edge wet with melted snow. I picked it up. 2 shaky words on the front. Don't do this, Mom. I didn't have to open it to know. Daniel. I sat on the bed, holding the envelope. Memories flooded in. His laughter as a boy. The nights I read him stories. His tiny hand clutching mine on his first day of school. Then it all dissolved, replaced by the image of him standing still as I crashed through the glass door. I didn't open it. I placed it in the drawer. If he truly wanted to speak, he could do it with an apology, not an unsigned note left in the dark. The next morning, Ruth texted me. Court date confirmed. Prepare your testimony. We're going to win. I replied, Thank you, Ruth. I'll be there early. When I closed my phone, the morning light slipped through the blinds, glinting off the small scratch on my silver locket. I touched it and smiled. The scar that once marked pain was now a mark of victory. I stood, brewed a fresh pot of tea, and breathed deeply. No more trembling. No more fear. I knew the journey had only begun. But this time, I would walk it with my head held high. Not as a victim, but as the storyteller of my own truth. And if you've stayed with me till this moment, I want you to pause and ask yourself, have you ever been belittled so deeply that silence felt like your only dignity? If you have, remember, silence isn't surrender. It's the beginning of strength. And if you want to walk beside me on this path toward justice, subscribe now, because in the next chapter, as the truth comes to light, you'll witness me rise, not as the victim they made me, but as the victor I chose to become. The day of the preliminary hearing arrived faster than I expected. I woke as the first light crept through the thin motel curtains. I hadn't slept all night. My mind was a storm, swirling with papers, Ruth's voice reminding me silence is our ally, the sound of shattering glass, and my son's voice calling Mom when he was 8. All of it blended together, not loud, but relentless. I brewed tea. My hands no longer trembled. I had grown used to this feeling, the quiet tension of preparing for battle. Except my weapon wasn't steel. It was truth. My outfit was simple. A beige sweater, long coat, gray silk scarf. Ruth once told me, don't dress like a victim. Walk in there as someone demanding respect. I nodded to my reflection, at the woman they once thought weak, now ready to step across the line of fear. When I arrived at court, Ruth was already there. Black blazer, thick folder neatly stacked before her. The judge is Helen Moran, Ruth said softly. Strict but fair. We have everything we need, don't worry. I nodded, though my heart thudded so loud it echoed in my ears when the courtroom doors opened. Across the room sat Daniel and Sloane. My son wore a navy suit, hair slicked back, looking older, heavier. Sloane, as always, looked flawless, sharp, cold, unreadable. She glanced at me long enough to send a message. You've gone too far, Addie. I didn't respond, because now, every word I spoke carried legal weight. When Judge Moran entered, the air shifted. She looked at me, then at them. We are here for Fairfax, Adelaide versus Fairfax, Daniel and Mercer, Sloane. Charges, elder abuse and financial coercion. I clasped my hands tightly, listening. Ruth began first, calm, deliberate, every syllable landing like a nail driven straight. Your Honor, Exhibit A, the medical report confirming the victim's injuries are consistent with impact against tempered glass. Exhibit B, video footage from a concealed camera, original and unaltered, showing the defendants pushing Mrs. Fairfax through the sliding door. The screen lit up. Silence filled the courtroom. The crash of glass echoed. Sloane's voice shouted, "She slipped!" And then, my body disappearing from view. Daniel bowed his head. Sloane bit her lip, her icy eyes clouding over. Judge Moran watched to the end, then turned to their attorney. Would you like to respond? He rose quickly. Your Honor, my clients insist this was a family misunderstanding, no intent to harm. Perhaps Mrs. Fairfax lost her balance on a wet floor. The judge interrupted, voice like dry ice. No one accidentally pushes someone on a wet floor. I've seen the footage. This was deliberate. My body loosened, the tension leaving me, not from triumph, but because truth had spoken and I hadn't needed to scream. Ruth continued. Additionally, the bank confirms forged documents attempting to seize assets from a $21 million trust legally belonging to Mrs. Fairfax. We request all related transactions be frozen pending investigation. Judge Moran nodded, taking notes. Then her voice, firm and final. Request granted. Mrs. Fairfax's assets will remain fully protected. The defendants are prohibited from contact or approach in any form until the final ruling. The gavel struck once. A single thud. Sharp. Final. And to me it sounded like the door of hell closing behind them. Daniel stayed seated, eyes down. Sloane shot to her feet, trying to look composed, but I saw her hand tremble. As they walked past me, I said nothing, only met their eyes. For the first time, they were the ones who looked away. Outside, the cold wind swept leaves across the courthouse steps. Ruth walked beside me, her hand briefly resting on my shoulder. We won the first round, Addie, she said quietly. But stay cautious. People like Sloane don't accept defeat easily. I smiled faintly. I know, but this time I'm not afraid. She looked at me, half admiration, half reflection. You remind me of myself when I was younger, except it took me a lifetime to learn your kind of calm. I replied simply, I have nothing left to lose, except my dignity, and I won't let anyone take that again. We parted at the courthouse gate. I stood alone for a moment, looking up at the gray Denver sky. A weak beam of sunlight broke through the clouds, glinting off the icy pavement. And in that fragile light, I felt lighter, like 3D. Back at the motel, I opened my laptop. My inbox overflowed with updates. The bank confirmed the freeze. The legal office received authorization to pursue forgery charges. And one brief message from Oliver. Addie, you made people respect you today. Congratulations. I laughed softly, pressing a hand to my chest. For the first time in years, I felt proud of myself. Not because of the $21 million in the trust, but because I had reclaimed something far more valuable. My voice. Before sleeping, I opened my small notebook and wrote, Justice never comes early. It comes when we are strong enough to face it. I closed the notebook and turned off the light. Outside, the street glow reflected off the window. Faint, golden, shimmering on the thin layer of frost. Like the crack in the glass that once scarred me, it remained, but no longer hurt. And I whispered to myself, tomorrow, I start writing the next chapter of my life. If you've listened this far, I want to ask you, do you believe justice always finds its way to those betrayed, if they're brave enough to stand up? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you want to walk with me as the story unfolds, hit subscribe, because in the next chapter, I'll tell you how they tried to strike back, and how I turned their revenge into my final victory. The next morning, I began my day by opening the case files again, not to reread them, but to remind myself that everything had truly begun to change. I was still in that small roadside motel near Cherry Creek, the smell of coffee mixing with the chill of winter air. But this time, when I looked into the mirror, the reflection staring back wasn't trembling. I saw a woman who had suffered enough to understand that strength doesn't come from youth. It comes from the will to survive. I brewed a cup of herbal tea, then picked up my phone. There was a message from Ruth. Addie, I want you to meet someone who can strengthen your case. Your former neighbor. Do you remember her name? I froze for a second. June Whittaker, I whispered. Ruth replied, if she's willing to confirm what she saw that night, her testimony will complete the puzzle. I set the phone down, put on my heavy coat, and stepped outside. The snow had mostly melted, leaving behind gray puddles that reflected the dull silver sky. The road back to my old neighborhood was only 15 minutes away, but it felt like a long walk through a memory I wasn't ready to touch. I parked a few houses away, not wanting to draw attention. Everything looked the same. The wreaths still hanging, the driveway still salted for ice. Only one thing had changed. The house at number 19, mine, now had its curtains tightly shut. I got out, gripping my purse like a lifeline to courage. After 2 gentle knocks, the door of June Whittaker's house opened. She stood there, small frame, silver hair, eyes wide with surprise and worry. Adelaide! Oh Lord, I thought you'd left town. Not quite, I said softly. I need to talk to you, just for a few minutes. She hesitated, then opened the door wider. Come in. I have warm tea. Inside, her home smelled of cinnamon and oak. It was cozy, painfully so, like a reminder of a world untouched by betrayal. She placed 2 cups of tea on the table, her voice trembling. That day, I saw it, Addie. I saw you walking through the snow, blood on your sleeve. I wanted to run out, but Sloane looked straight at my window. I got scared. I didn't know what they might do. I reached out and laid my hand over hers. You did nothing wrong, June. I just need the truth. If you tell the court what you saw, it could protect me. And maybe protect others, too. June was quiet for a long time. Her glasses fogged from the steam. Finally, she nodded. I'll do it. I can't stay silent anymore. That image haunts me every night I squeezed her hand. Thank you, June. You just gave me my first real breath in months. I opened my bag, pulled out my laptop, and played the owl camera video. The pale blue glow lit her wrinkled face. When the sound of glass breaking filled the room, June gasped, tears running down her cheeks. Dear God, they said you slipped, but they pushed you. I nodded. All I need is your statement and your signature. My attorney will handle the rest. An hour later, we sat in Ruth's office. Delgado listened carefully, taking notes while June spoke. When June finally signed her affidavit, I felt like another solid brick had been laid in the wall of justice I'd been building. Ruth slipped the document into the file and said quietly, "Now we have a witness. That means this isn't just assault. It's intentional harm. The court will take it even more seriously." I exhaled, feeling something close to relief. But as I left the office, a sudden instinct made me glance toward the street. Across the road, a black sedan idled by the curb. Through the tinted window, I saw a figure holding up a phone, taking pictures. I didn't need to guess. Sloane, she'd always tried to control everything, even when everything was slipping through her hands. I hurried into my car, heart pounding. I wasn't afraid, but I knew this fight had now moved beyond the courtroom. That evening, when I returned to the motel, a small envelope lay under the door. No return address. Inside, a single white sheet printed with cold, bold letters. Justice won't save you if you don't know how to stay silent. I stared at it for a long time, then folded it neatly and slipped it into my file with the rest of the evidence. Not 1 ounce of fear. If they thought threats could make me stop, they'd forgotten. I'd already survived their first attack. I called Ruth and told her what happened. She paused, then said calmly, "Keep it. It's just one more piece of proof of their cowardice." I asked softly, "Ruth, don't you ever get tired of fighting?" She gave a low chuckle. "Tired? Of course. But I'm more tired of watching good people be forced into silence, not because of justice, but because of fear." Her words echoed in my head all night. I lay there staring at the ceiling, the yellow glow from the streetlight cutting across the walls. And I realized, maybe strength isn't about winning at all. Maybe it's about continuing, even when everything tries to pull you down. I opened my phone and returned to the channel I'd started, the one where I shared real stories about justice, betrayal, and rebirth. I typed a new description. This isn't just the story of Adelaide Fairfax. It's a reminder to anyone who's ever been pushed down that you can rise again. And once you do, you'll never fall the same way twice. Then I uploaded the first clip, the video of the judge's temporary ruling. No music, no effects, just my voice and my eyes. I didn't care about thousands of views. I just hoped one person would see it and think, if she can do it, maybe I can too. When the screen flashed, "Upload complete," I smiled. A new chapter was opening, not just in my case file, but in my heart. And if you've stayed with me till now, I want to ask you one honest question. Do you believe that truth always finds its way, no matter how deeply people try to bury it? If you do, leave a heart or a comment, "I believe in truth," below this video, because sometimes that small message from you might give strength to someone else fighting for justice, just like me that night in my little motel room. After the video went live, I thought things would quiet down. But the very next day, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Not from Ruth or Oliver, but from strangers, shaky voices, breaking mid-sentence, some even crying through the line. "Mrs. Adelaide, my son kicked me out too. I saw your video. I've been silent for 3 years, but now I want to speak. I believe in the truth." I sat there listening, eyes wet. I never imagined my story would reach so many hearts. The video spread quickly. Thousands of comments poured in. Some were angry, some compassionate, some skeptical. But I didn't mind, because I knew people only doubt what they've never had to survive. That night, Ruth called. "Addie, you know your video's gone viral, right?" I let out a small laugh. I had a feeling. "That's not entirely good," she said softly. "They'll claim you're trying to sway public opinion, but in a way, that's what keeps the court from ignoring you now." I understood. This story was no longer just mine. It had become a voice for everyone who'd ever been forced into silence. The next morning, Ruth asked me to come in to sign a few new papers. When I arrived, she was speaking with a tall man in a gray coat and glasses. "Addie, this is Carter Wells, a private investigator I've hired to track Sloan and Daniel's movements." I shook his hand. "What have you found?" He opened a folder filled with photographs. Sloan meeting a middle-aged man outside a cafe in Aurora. "This man's Ryan Cook, a notary public. He stamped documents for Sloan's firm before. Turns out, he's the one who certified the fake authorization papers sent to the bank." I frowned. "So they're still trying to work around the freeze?" "Yes," Carter said, "but Cook's been suspended. He's cooperating in exchange for immunity. And he just testified that the one who paid him off was Daniel Fairfax." The room went silent. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I had suspected it, but hearing it out loud felt like a knife. "Daniel?" I whispered. "Not Sloan?" Carter nodded. "Your son." I didn't even remember sitting down. The world blurred around me. Ruth's voice softened. "I know this hurts, Addie, but this is the final piece. It proves the fraud was organized and intentional." I nodded slowly, biting my lip. Some part of me had still believed Daniel was being manipulated, but now there was no illusion left. I took a long breath. "Ruth, I don't want to destroy my son's life, but I can't let the man who shoved me through a glass door walk free." Ruth met my eyes. "You're not destroying anything. You're just letting truth do its job." I left the office and drove down Spear Boulevard. The sky was unusually clear, sunlight shimmering off the Platte River like a trembling mirror. I rolled the window down and let the cold air rush in. For the first time in months, I felt no hatred, only exhaustion, and a quiet sorrow for the boy who once promised, "I'll never let you be alone, Mom." Later that afternoon, Carter sent me an audio file, a recording from Cook's phone during the transaction with Daniel. Daniel's voice was unmistakable. "Just stamp it. I'll send the rest later. My mom will never find out I stopped the playback right there." I couldn't listen to more. The room suddenly felt freezing. I pressed a hand against my chest and closed my eyes. That phrase, "my mom," echoed in my mind like a farewell between two worlds. That evening, Ruth emailed, "Tomorrow's the second hearing. Both defendants are being summoned for forgery and obstruction. Be ready, they might confront you directly." I wasn't afraid, but there was a hollow space inside me. The space where motherhood used to live, now filled with ashes. When I arrived at court the next morning, the press was waiting. Camera flashes burst. Voices shouted questions. "Mrs. Fairfax, do you think your son regrets it? Why did you release the video?" I said nothing. I just walked, steady, deliberate, the same way I had walked through the snow that night. without looking back. Inside, Daniel avoided my eyes. Sloane sat beside him, her expression tight, her hands clasped too hard. Ruth presented the new evidence: the audio, Carter's notes, Cook's sworn statement. When Daniel's voice filled the courtroom, he shut his eyes. His face went pale. Judge Moran looked up. "Mr. Fairfax, do you have anything to say?" He hesitated. Then, in a trembling voice, I'm sorry." The room froze. "I didn't know it would go this far," he said quietly. "I thought I could control it." I looked at him, and for the first time I didn't see a traitor. I saw a lost son. The judge ruled to maintain the asset freeze and open a full criminal investigation. From that moment on, Daniel and Sloane's lives veered down a road with no way back. After the hearing, Ruth said gently, "Addie, you can rest now. The law will handle the rest." I nodded, but deep down I knew no one truly wins a battle like this. Only truth stands tall. That afternoon, I drove to Maple Lake. The wind rippled across the water's surface, sunlight flickering like a heartbeat. I opened my phone and checked my channel. The video had passed 1 million views, tens of thousands of comments. "You spoke for all the mothers who couldn't. Thank you for showing that silence can be strength." I read them slowly, my vision blurring. Then I typed one new line in the description. "Justice isn't an ending. It's the beginning of peace. And if you've listened to me until now, maybe you too have felt the sting of betrayal, then silenced, dismissed, or broken. Write me just one line in the comments. Tell me what pain you've survived. Because sometimes sharing is how we heal. And maybe your story will be the small light someone else needs, the same way mine was that winter in Denver. When I posted that line, I didn't expect what would happen next. Within hours, the comment section overflowed. Stories from mothers, daughters, wives who'd been pushed out of their own homes. "My son kicked me out after my husband died. Thank you for giving me the courage to speak. I never believed justice could stand on my side, but because of you, I'll try." I sat there reading, throat tightening, not out of pity, but because I understood their silence, the silence that once made me feel weak, but now I know it was the beginning of strength. Just as I was about to close my laptop, my phone rang. It was Ruth. "Addie, where are you?" Her voice was tense. "At home, Ruth. Why?" "Carter just called. They, Sloane and Daniel, have been summoned for a second interrogation. But something bigger just surfaced. There's a third person behind the fake transfers. A name came up in Cook's statement. My pulse quickened. A third person? Who? Ruth hesitated. Lucas Mercer, Sloane's brother. I froze. The room seemed to spin. Lucas, the man who used to visit occasionally, polite, fixing a leaking faucet, smiling kindly. I never imagined he'd be part of this, Ruth continued. It appears he supplied the old certification forms and helped them create the fake documents. Carter's tracing money transfers between Lucas and Sloane. I lowered my head, gripping the table. Ruth, I said softly, if they fail in court, they won't stop. They'll find another way. I know, she replied. That's why you need to leave the city for a few days. I've arranged a cabin in Aspen Springs. Quiet, private security. Go tonight. I hesitated, then nodded. I understand. That afternoon, I packed one small suitcase, the case files, the hard drive with the footage, and my old notebook. Before leaving, I checked the latest comment on my video. Mrs. Adelaide, if they try to hurt you, remember, thousands of us stand with you. I smiled faintly. Thank you, I whispered, as if the writer could hear me. The road to Aspen Springs curved through snowy mountains. Cold wind whipped against the car windows, snowmelt glinting in the fading light. By the time I arrived, twilight had settled. The cabin, Pinewood, nestled on a quiet hill, was surrounded by tall firs and deep silence. No cars, just the smell of sap and the hum of wind through trees. I lit a fire in the stone hearth and sat by the flickering light. On the first page of my notebook, I wrote, Day 1. Quiet, but not peaceful. In. I tried to sleep, but the wind outside sounded too familiar, like the night I was pushed through glass, the sting of cold, the burning line of pain along my skin. Those sensations never disappear. They just hide under thicker layers of memory. Near midnight, I heard a sound on the porch. Footsteps. Slow, then the groan of wood. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out. The wind whipped against my face. Snow dusted the railing. No one there, only a small envelope half buried in snow. I brought it inside. Across the front, in messy handwriting, Addie, stop before it's too late. I laughed quietly. Nothing could scare me now. I placed the envelope in the fire. The paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash. The flames reflected in my eyes like an old, stubborn promise that refused to die. The next morning, Carter called. Addie, good news! We found the financial trail. $90,000 wired from Lucas to a brokerage Daniel used for the forged paperwork. This will destroy their defense. I exhaled. Good. Then justice just grew a second leg. He chuckled. Exactly. But be ready. When this breaks, the press will come after you. I'm not hiding, I said. If silence gives them power, then speaking out is how I stay alive. Later that afternoon, Ruth called again. Her tone lighter this time. I just spoke with the prosecutor. They're adding the entire file to the official case, and they want you to be the first witness. I paused, then answered, I'll do it. That night, I sat alone in the cabin, staring into the fire. From my wallet, I pulled an old photo. Me and Daniel, when he was 12, both smiling by the lake. Those innocent eyes hurt to look at. I whispered, My son, I've forgiven you. But I'll never forget. Not out of hate, but to remember that blind love can cost us everything. I slid the photo between the pages of my notebook. Outside, the wind howled, echoing through the pines like ghosts of the past trying to return. I closed my eyes and whispered, Let the wind carry the old things away. Tomorrow I'll go back, not for revenge, but to reclaim my name. At sunrise, I left Aspen. Golden light spilled over the snow, turning it into glass. As I drove down the mountain, my phone rang. Ruth again. Addie, they've added money laundering to the charges. Lucas confessed his part in the forgeries. I smiled faintly. So finally, every layer of their lies is melting. Yes, she said, but get ready. Reporters will want interviews. They might come to your door. Let them, I replied. I'll speak, not to strike back, but to remind people that silence is never the answer. When I hung up, a lightness filled my chest. It wasn't over yet, but my life no longer lived under their shadow. And if you've stayed with me this far, maybe you understand. Not everyone gets the chance to stand up, but everyone deserves the right to speak. If you've been through something like this, write in the comments, I'm not silent anymore, because sometimes just those 3 words are enough to make the whole world stop and listen. I'm not silent anymore. And somehow it feels like the world is finally listening. 2 days after I left Aspen, the headlines exploded across every screen. 71-year-old mother sues son and daughter-in-law for elder abuse and property fraud. Caught on video. The media did what justice sometimes can't. It shined the light. Ruth called almost immediately. "Addie, I hope you're ready for the storm." I smiled faintly. "I've already survived a real one, Ruth. Everything after that is just wind." She laughed softly, though I could hear the worry behind her voice. "Justice will be on your side, but the public won't always be. Some will praise you, others will mock you. Keep your composure," I understood. Truth always comes with a cost, and I paid mine in blood. That afternoon, I was invited to a live interview on Denver local news. The host, Lydia Bennett, was in her 40s, calm but sharp-eyed, her tone the kind that cut gently yet clean. The studio was bright, the air cold, the microphones gleaming black. She looked at me and smiled politely. "Mrs. Fairfax, many see you as a symbol of resilience, but others say you were too harsh, suing your own son. What do you say to that?" I took a slow breath. People call me cold because they've never known what it feels like to be pushed through glass by the child they raised. I didn't sue my son. I stood up for the mother he forgot. The studio went silent. Lydia nodded once. "If there's one message you could share with viewers, especially those enduring quiet forms of abuse at home, what would it be?" I looked straight into the camera. Don't be afraid of your own voice. Silence doesn't protect you. It protects the one who's hurting you. That moment hit harder than I expected. Within hours, the interview went viral. Hundreds of thousands watched. Tens of thousands commented. She spoke what I've never been able to say. I was scared once, not anymore. Thank you, Adelaide. I won't be silent either. I sat alone, the glow of my phone lighting my face. And for the first time, I cried. Not from pain, but because I had turned my pain into purpose. That night, Ruth called again. "Addie, you have no idea what that interview just did." The prosecutor expedited the case. They found the final transaction records between Lucas and Sloan. They're officially adding money laundering charges. "We're almost at the end," I whispered. "The end for them, not for me." Outside, snow drifted softly under the streetlights. Across the road, an elderly couple walked hand in hand under a shared umbrella. The sight eased something in me. Maybe peace isn't about winning. Maybe it's about learning to smile again after the storm. The next morning, Ruth told me the final hearing would take place in a week. I spent the day organizing files, papers that were no longer just evidence, but witnesses of the journey. Each stamp, each signature, each line that read verified was a full stop to another lie. That afternoon, Carter arrived with an envelope. "There's something you should see," he said, setting it on the table. Inside was a handwritten letter from Daniel. "His lawyer sent it this morning," Carter said quietly. "I thought you'd want to read it." I sat down, sunlight catching the edges of the paper. "Mom, I know no apology can undo what I've done. There's no excuse. But I'm scared. Scared of losing everything. Scared of being ruined. Sloan told me you'd never forgive me, and in that fear, I made the worst choice. If you're reading this, please know I never stopped loving you. I just didn't have the courage to stand beside you when I should have. I'm sorry. Daniel." I folded the letter slowly. I didn't feel forgiveness or anger, just a deep, quiet sorrow for a son who let fear erase the best parts of himself. He needs to face it, I told Carter. Forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. He nodded. You're strong, Addie. Most people wouldn't still be standing. I smiled faintly. I'm not strong, Carter. I've just lost too much to let myself fall again. 3 days later, the news broke. Sloane Mercer's real estate license had been suspended for document fraud. She lost her contracts, her reputation, her control, all the things she fought so ruthlessly to steal. Ruth sent me the news link. I watched the footage of Sloane leaving the courthouse, hollow-eyed, her hand covering her face. I felt no triumph, only a deep quiet, as if the world had finally reset itself. That evening, I stepped out onto the porch. Snow dusted the railing, the air crisp and still. I poured a small glass of red wine and raised it toward the night sky. To those who were once called weak, I whispered, and to everyone still finding their voice. The cold wind brushed past, flickering the candle beside me, but the flame didn't go out. I smiled. And if you've listened this far, I want to ask you something. Do you believe that forgiveness and justice can exist together? Leave me a short comment. I believe, or I'm still learning to believe, because sometimes those few small words can be the comfort someone else needs to make it through their own storm. I'm still learning to believe, and maybe life is learning to give me back what I deserve. 3 days after the interview, Ruth called to say that the judge had set the official trial date. "Next week, Addie," she said. "This will be the final chapter of the case. After that, it's written into the record forever." I paused, then whispered, "I'm ready." The truth is, I wasn't, because deep down, a small part of me, the part that once made dinner for my family, that once believed love could fix anything, still ached. I didn't want to watch my son be sentenced. I just wanted the lies to stop. The morning of the trial was dry and cold. Denver's sky was gray, but sunlight broke through the clouds like silver threads. I wore a long coat, a silk scarf, and clutched my file folder tight, as if holding my courage. When I entered the courtroom, Ruth stood ready, calm as always. Daniel sat to the right, hands clasped, looking years older. Sloane, beside him, hollow-eyed, her once perfect hair a tangled mess. The judge's gavel struck. This court is now in session for Fairfax versus Fairfax and Mercer Ruth. Presented first. Evidence after evidence. The recordings, the video, the forged bank forms, Cook's statement, and June Whittaker's testimony. The room was silent except for the soft rustle of paper and the pounding of my heart. When Daniel's voice echoed through the speakers, my mom will never find out. I didn't cry. I just looked at him. He couldn't meet my eyes. The defense tried to pivot. "Your Honor, this is a family tragedy, not a criminal conspiracy." The actions were emotional, not deliberate. The judge lifted her gaze, sharp as glass. Emotional outbursts don't produce forged documents and fake notarizations. This was a plan. Silence fell again. Ruth's hand rested gently on my shoulder. "The judge is leaning our way," she whispered. Then it was my turn. I stepped to the stand, gripping the wooden rail to steady my hands. "Mrs. Adelaide Fairfax," the judge said, "do you wish to speak before sentencing?" I nodded. "Your Honor," I began softly, "I didn't come here to win. I came to prove that truth still has a voice, even after years of being buried. I don't want my son imprisoned. I just want justice to call things by their right name." I turned toward Daniel. His eyes were red, his head bowed. "I forgive him," I said quietly. "Not to forget, but to set myself free. But forgiveness doesn't mean silence. And I ask this court, please don't stay silent for those who are told they're too old, too weak, or too quiet to fight for themselves." The room held its breath. The judge nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Fairfax. The court acknowledges your courage." Then came the verdict. each word cut and healed all at once. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Adelaide Fairfax. The full $21 million trust remains under her legal ownership. Defendants Daniel Fairfax and Sloan Mercer are found guilty of document forgery, financial fraud, and elder assault. A permanent restraining order is granted. A separate criminal investigation will proceed against Lucas Mercer for money laundering. When the gavel struck, I closed my eyes. From that snowy night, the crash of glass, the sound of my own heartbeat, to this moment, it felt like waking from a long nightmare. Only this time, I was standing. Sloan shot to her feet, voice trembling with rage. "You destroyed your family for pride!" The judge's gavel fell again. "Order!" I met Sloan's eyes calmly. "No," I said. "I saved my soul, and others like me, from silence." Daniel said nothing. He just buried his face in his hands. As I walked past, his voice cracked behind me. "Mom, I'm sorry." I stopped, but didn't turn around. Say it to yourself, Daniel. When you truly understand what truth means. Outside the courthouse, sunlight hit the snow, bright and blinding. Ruth smiled. "You did it, Addie." I shook my head. Not just me. Thousands of us, each fighting in our own quiet way. That night, I returned to my small lakeside rental. I recorded a short video. No music, no filters, just my voice. Today, I won. But what I want to share isn't victory. It's the belief that justice isn't only for the rich or powerful. It's for anyone brave enough to stand up. If you're living in fear, know this. Sometimes, one small step is all it takes for the darkness to start retreating. When it went live, the comments poured in. "I filed for divorce after 20 years of control. I called the police last night. Your story gave me courage." "You didn't just fight for yourself, Mrs. Fairfax. You fought for all of us." I sat in silence, listening to the wind brush against the window pane. What I felt wasn't pride. It was peace. No more trembling at the sound of a door. No more fear of speaking. Just a stillness, the kind that comes not from weakness, but from strength. Outside, snow drifted lazily over the lake, glowing silver beneath the streetlight, and I whispered to myself, silence used to be my prison. Now, it's my freedom. If you've stayed with me until now, I want you to remember one thing. Your voice has power. No matter where you are, no matter how much it hurts, don't let anyone silence you. And if you believe that truth, even when late, is still worth waiting for, leave a comment that says, "I believe in the truth," because when you do, you're helping keep alive the light that people like me and countless others have fought to ignite. I believe in the truth, and maybe that belief itself has opened a brand new chapter in my life. After the trial, Denver slid gently into early spring. The snow melted slowly, revealing soft soil and the scent of young grass pushing through the thaw. I began learning how to live again, not as a winner, but as someone finally free after years of being imprisoned by fear and silence. Each morning, I brewed mint tea, opened the window, and let the sound of birds replace the echo of shattering glass. The pain was still there, of course. Some nights I woke to the slam of a door in my dreams, or saw shards of glass falling through the snow. But every time I opened my eyes, I knew I was no longer trapped in that moment. I had walked out. A week after the verdict, Ruth called. "Addie, the prosecutor wants your permission to use your story in a campaign against domestic abuse." I laughed softly. "I don't think a 71-year-old woman makes much of a media campaign, Ruth." "Not media," she said gently. "A message. They want to use your words to encourage others to speak up." I was quiet for a long moment. Maybe that was exactly what I was meant to do with the years I had left. "All right," I said. "If my story can spare even one person what I went through, then yes." That evening, I sat at my desk and rewrote everything, every memory, every feeling, not as a complaint, but as a record. I titled the manuscript, "When Silence Breaks." I didn't know if anyone would ever read it, but I wrote it anyway, because I needed the past to speak one last time, and then rest. Late that month, Carter called. "Want to know how it all ended?" "I suppose I do." "Sloane confessed, signed restitution, and was permanently banned from practice. Lucas got 7 years for laundering." "And Daniel," he paused. "He checked himself into a rehabilitation center." I closed my eyes, breathing through the ache. "He asked to see you," Carter added, "but I told him you might need time." I smiled faintly. "No, Carter. Time is the one thing I've learned not to demand. If he truly wants to make things right, he'll live better. Seeing me isn't what matters anymore." After the call, I looked out over Maple Lake. The water caught the colors of dusk, orange melting into silver, and I realized justice isn't watching someone punished. It's finding peace without hatred. One morning in May, an envelope arrived from the courthouse. The official closure notice, stamped in red, just a few dry lines, yet it felt like a certificate of freedom. I took it to the Montreux Initiative, the women's shelter I'd supported through my trust. They'd named a new program, the Fairfax Grant, to help older women find safety and free legal aid. When I walked in, familiar faces smiled and hugged me. Felicia, once the woman who said, "I feel invisible," now led financial training for survivors. Donna, who once handed me a trembling letter, now managed a branch office in Boulder. Looking at them, I understood that every painful story, once spoken aloud, becomes a lantern for someone still lost. Felicia handed me a folder. "Mrs. Addy, we'd like you to sign here. The program officially carries your name." I laughed softly. I never wanted to be a symbol. I just want women to know they're not alone. "That's exactly why we chose your name," she said. My hand trembled slightly as I signed. The ink dried fast, as if closing a long chapter. That night, back in my cottage, I lit the old lamp and opened a wooden box on the shelf. Inside was Daniel's photograph, still young, still gentle. I placed it by the window where moonlight touched the glass. "My son," I whispered, "I've already forgiven you, even if you never ask. And if someday you come back, I'll open the door, not so you can earn forgiveness, but so you'll know it never truly closed." I set the photo down and returned to my desk to write the final lines of my manuscript. I no longer seek revenge. I write so that someone trembling in the dark will know they are not alone. Truth may cost you everything: family, respect, home. But it gives back the one thing no one can take: dignity. When I finished, a soft breeze slipped through the cracks in the window. Not the biting wind of winter, but the gentle breath of peace. And I knew my life, however many years remained, would be lived freely, without fear. A few weeks later, I was invited to speak at Voices of Truth, a gathering for survivors reclaiming their voices. I stood on the small stage, the light warm on my face, dozens of people watching, people who had suffered, hidden, and now smiled again. I held the microphone and said slowly, "The night I was pushed through the glass door, I thought my life was over, but that was the night I was born again." Sometimes it's only when we fall that we discover how strong we can stand. I looked out at them, at all those shining eyes. "Justice doesn't come quickly," I said. but it always comes to those who don't give up. And if my story makes even one person believe a little more in themselves, then everything I endured was worth it. The room erupted in quiet, steady applause, not loud, but full of warmth, like arms wrapping around every scarred heart. I smiled and bowed my head, feeling peace settle deep inside me. If you're still listening, you already know. Every door that slams shut isn't meant to trap you. Sometimes it's forcing you to find another door, the one where light is waiting. If my story gives you even a spark of strength, leave a comment or write, "I'm ready to open the door." Because the moment you do, even with just a few words, you've already begun the first chapter of your own story of justice. And just like that, the story of Mrs. Adelaide Fairfax comes to an end. Not with tears, nor with hatred, but with the light of truth and unwavering courage. From a mother betrayed by her own son and daughter-in-law, pushed down in the snow on a freezing night, she rose, not for revenge, but to reclaim justice and her own dignity. She did not win through wealth or power, but through her belief in the truth, her courage to speak, and a heart strong enough to forgive. Her story reminds us all that silence is not weakness, and age is never a reason to give up on justice. Whoever you are, wherever you are, if one day you are hurt, overlooked, or pushed out of the home that was once yours, remember this: you can still stand up, speak the truth, and reclaim your light. Because justice may come late, but it always finds those who refuse to give up. If this story touched your heart, if you believe that justice and kindness still exist in this world, leave me a heart or a comment that says, "I believe in the truth." Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone you care about, because maybe they too are waiting for a small spark of light to help them step out of their own darkness. Thank you for listening till the very end. See you in the next video as we continue our journey through justice, love, and the quiet strength of the human heart.